We have one of the world's most experts on hate speech to join us, I know that for MIGS, we've been wanting to meet with her for a couple of years now, so we're very fortunate to have her come up to Montreal. So not just to impart her wisdom and knowledge with you, but also to meet our institute staff as we share a common mandate. We're going to hear from her about hate speech, particularly related to the Kenya case. Kenya, as you heard before, went through extreme violence in 2007 after the elections. Election just took place a short while ago, so we're going to really hear about how hate speech can be used or mobilized to commit atrocities and how you can confront that. So I'm going to ask my colleague Alejandra to come up and introduce her and read out her bio. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is a privilege to introduce to you the last speaker of our professional training program, Susan Benesch, who will be leading the session on the third case study of the day, entitled Dangerous Speech and the Case of Kenya. Susan Benesch is a fellow in genocide prevention at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York, where she directs the Dangerous Speech on the Road to Mass Violence project. She also teaches human rights at the American University School of International Service. She has lectured and published widely and holds law degrees from both Yale and Georgetown. A worldwide authority on the role of inflammatory speech in catalyzing violence, offline and online, she has been working in Kenya during the recent years, experimenting with new methods to prevent mass violence. Currently, she is leading a new international group against hatred online, composed of human rights groups and the world's largest internet company. Please join me in welcoming Susan Benesch.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor and pleasure to be here. Et puis ça me fait énorme plaisir de pouvoir partager avec vous et de pouvoir recevoir après vos questions. I have a lot to say, like Vesma, and will do my best to speak as briefly as possible so that we can get to your undoubtedly terrific questions. I must say, I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to attend the last 2 days based on what I heard this morning. So I'm going to do essentially two things. One is to make a rather dramatic and provocative claim to you and then try to back it up. That is a claim about the role of inflammatory speech as a catalyst of mass violence and the possibilities for using that to interfere with and to possibly limit mass violence. And the second thing I'd like to do is show you how I have played a little role together with a very path-breaking Kenyan researchers in attempting to apply some of those ideas in Kenya. So as I said, I want to talk about speech that can catalyze heinous collective violence, including genocide, and what can be done specifically and concretely to inhibit that. So first of all, as you know, speech is enormously powerful. It is an essential tool for bringing about any collective action, including violence. But not all speech has the same capacity or force, as the philosophers of language put it, to drive action. Not even all hateful speech. So some hate speech can catalyze violence, can increase the likelihood of violence, and other hate speech does not. This is a distinction that is rarely noticed. So I suggest to you that we must focus on prohibiting and diminishing speech that has a special power to lead to collective violence, such as genocide, not least because freedom of expression must be protected. This is another important point that, in my view, doesn't get nearly enough attention. Freedom of expression must be protected, first, because it is a fundamental human right, but second, equally importantly, because restricting freedom of expression may itself increase the likelihood of violence. Why is that? Because if people don't have peaceful means of expressing their grievances, then they may eventually resort to violence. I hope that makes sense to you all. And if not, I know you'll ask questions about it. So the solution, in my view, is to concentrate on speech that is authentically dangerous, that has this special capacity to catalyze violence. That begs the question, can it be identified? Is there a way of estimating the dangerousness of a particular act of speech? Again, I borrow a term from the philosophy of language. There's a very useful body of thought called speech act theory, about which I'd love to talk, but I don't have time for that. You're welcome to ask me questions. So can this smaller subset of speech, which I have termed dangerous speech, can it be identified and distinguished from the much larger inchoate mass of something we call hate speech? But by the way, nobody knows really how to define hate speech, and there's no consensus on an international definition. So as you might imagine, I believe it is possible to distinguish this subset and to make educated guesses about the dangerousness of a particular speech act in its context. A speech act, by the way, need not be words. I refer to any form of expression. Speech act might be a film, might be a photograph, might be a t-shirt, as my students and I have discussed in detail. So I believe that one can make this distinction, and I'm going to show you my proposal for doing that, and again, welcome your critique. I have identified 5 criteria with which I think one can gauge or estimate the dangerousness of a particular speech act in which it was made or disseminated. I also have identified particular hallmarks of dangerous speech, and I should have begun by saying that I am very sorry that Dr. Molani's outstanding presentation made an excellent transition to mine, because she mentioned in several parts of her presentation examples of dangerous speech. For example, in Syria, once the whispers, once the distinction, not only the division of people into us and them, but the rumors that the other group is attacking either the audience population or people or things that are exceedingly important to that population, like shrines. As soon as you get vicious false rumors of that kind and they become convictions rather than just rumors, then exactly as she said, it has started. There is already great danger, and as you will see in just a moment, they are attacking our shrines, they are about to attack us, or they are attacking us, is an example of what I call accusation in the mirror. So then I'm just finishing a very brief introduction before I show you this, these guidelines or this analytical framework to identify dangerous speech in any context. I'd like to ask what can be done. If it is possible to identify this subset of dangerous speech, what could you do then to interfere with the psychosocial process that it brings about, which is to condition people so that they will at least condone mass violence, if not also take part in it? What is the most obvious answer? What would you do if you wanted to stop speech? Anybody? You could jam it. You could jam a radio station, for example, as was vigorously proposed before the Rwandan genocide, or in the case of Serbia, NATO, in fact, bombed a television station. Didn't work very well. The TV station was back on, although 9 people were killed in that bombing, the television station was back on the air very quickly. So jamming is possible. You can, in other words, limit dissemination of the speech, but it's usually difficult. What else could you do? Pardon me?
Criminalize it?
Criminalize it. So that would be one way of going after the speaker. What else could you do to the speaker? Oh, you're such human rightsies. You'd kill him, for example. You'd kill him, right? As the United States has done with a drone to Anwar al-Awlaki. That's not very effective either, because al-Awlaki's, just as an example, al-Awlaki's speech is still influencing people apparently. Particularly in this digital age, attempting to silence the speaker is not terribly effective. Any other ideas?
Actively take on their rhetoric with counter-arguments.
Aha. Counter rhetoric, counter speech. Instead of trying to proceed against the speaker or the speech itself with silencing or repression, perhaps you could try to, the way I conceptualize this is you could work with the audience. You could work with the audience by trying to counter the message, by trying to condition the audience in a different way. I have borrowed ideas from public health, a field that is way ahead of us in human rights in some respects. Again, I'd love to talk to you about that in more detail, but there isn't enough time. So I talk about inoculating the audience against dangerous speech, attempting to make people less susceptible to a poisonous and false message, such as they're burning our shrines. And in the second part of my talk, I'll tell you very quickly how, with Kenyan colleagues, I've begun experimenting with doing that in Kenya, in a project called Nipe Ukweli, which means in Kiswahili, give me truth, or more loosely translated, give me truth. It was a project that we launched toward the end of last year and the beginning of this year, in response to an alarming amount and level of virulence of dangerous speech that we found online in Kenya. So we decided in a set of frankly frantic Skype conversations that our project needed to shift from only research to attempting to do something actively. So we launched this kind of project as a child of the other project to attempt to counter dangerous speech. Okay, so that's the intro. Now let me invite you on a rapid gallop through, first of all, this dangerous speech set of ideas, and then secondly, a quick description of how it was applied to several projects in Kenya in the course of 2012 and early 2013. So first of all, as I said, I'm going to make this this proposal that inflammatory speech presents a singular opportunity. I began in this work because, as the slide says, inflammatory speech has been a precursor to many episodes of mass violence, particularly genocides, with high levels of civilian participation, and genocides where the victim groups lived interspersed with the majority population. That makes sense when you think about it. You would need to condition the majority population in cases where they're mixed with the victims. It wouldn't be so necessary in a case like Darfur, where the victim population is very geographically separate from the majority population, and indeed there is not such a high level of inflammatory speech in the case of Darfur. Perhaps you've already heard about this. This is just a slide to give you a little bit of a sense of the legal history of international criminal law on speech. I'm going to leap over it for now in order to get to the rest of the presentation, but I'm happy to discuss it in Q&A if you'd like. The bottom line, though, is that the first conviction for incitement to genocide, which is the best known international speech crime, came in the case of Jean-Paul Akayesu, who was convicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in what was also the first international conviction for genocide, as you probably already know. So this is the distinction to which I already gestured to you in my little introduction. Hate speech is not, in my view, a very useful category, particularly for violence prevention. Nobody really knows what, as I said before, there's no consensus on what it means. In most bodies of law, is not a crime per se. There are lots of other forms of speech crimes, and they don't line up with each other from body to body of national law, and unfortunately they also tend not to jive very well with international human rights law or international criminal law of speech. And as I said before, if your purpose is, as mine is, to prevent violence, then you would want to focus on speech that has that you suspect of having a particular capacity to help to catalyze violence. I'd like you to notice that I use the word catalyze, not cause. I never talk about speech causing violence, and there are a couple of very important reasons for this. One is that we don't know that. I'm sorry to tell you that lots of people who should know better, including judges at international tribunals, have gotten this wrong. In announcing the conviction and sentencing of 2 radio station executives from Rwanda and 1 newspaper editor, the International Tribunal for Rwanda said to one of the defendants, "Without a firearm or machete, you have caused the deaths of thousands of people." So I've written a book chapter complaining about this. As you might imagine, I wouldn't have been working on this topic for years if I didn't think it was likely that there is a link between inflammatory speech and mass violence. But causation, I'm a lawyer, you know, causation is something different. So it's important to maintain the distinction between things that we know and things that we suspect. Secondly, to speak of causation without evidence, for that matter, with or without evidence, would exonerate people of responsibility for making decisions based on their own individual will. You know that when you do anything, whether it's brushing your teeth or massacring your neighbor, you do it for many reasons, including that you heard this from somebody, you heard that from someone else, you watched TV on a particular day and heard some other message. So we are beginning to gather more and more evidence of the link between inflammatory speech and violence, but it's very unlikely that we'll ever be able to draw a bright causal line between one speech act and one act of violence for the simple reason that people do things for many different reasons. Okay, so dangerous speech is defined, according to my proposal, this is my term, as the subset of hate speech that has this special capacity. So I think that gives us 2 important, distinct opportunities for the prevention of collective violence. One is, at least it ought to give us a better early warning indicator in cases such as the Syrian one. Besma described that so well that I won't repeat it. And secondly, if we could learn to interfere with the process that dangerous speech brings about without curbing freedom of expression, then it might really be possible to at least diminish violence, if not prevent it entirely. And frankly, I can't think of another phenomenon that seems to so consistently precede episodes of mass violence. So it seems to me that this is quite an unusual opportunity. So in my project, I have these goals. And as you can see, I've tried to list the ways in which one might be able to interfere with speech, and I've become increasingly convinced that inoculating the audience, if we can figure out how to do it, is the most exciting one, but all of these should be explored further. And by the way, they've been explored remarkably little. To me, of course, I'm biased, but it seems very surprising. So here's the framework. 5 defining criteria. This is sort of a Weberian idea type of the most dangerous speech act. The 5 factors are, by the way, Aristotle already got the first 3, so I'm only adding 2. What makes a speech act dangerous? First of all, the speaker. Some speakers, you all know, have a much greater capacity to influence a particular audience than other speakers. These need not be political figures. Very often cultural or religious figures have even greater sway over certain audiences. The second factor is the audience itself. Of course, some audiences, for all kinds of reasons, are more susceptible or vulnerable to inciting inflammatory speech than others. I'm sure you can think of lots of the factors. The third is the Speech Act itself, of course, which is very often not explicit. Inciting language is often expressed in coded or elliptical language, in part because the formation of a jargon or a code or special words, in my view, from studying lots of cases, is itself often a glue that binds the audience and the speaker more tightly together. And then the fourth is the social and historical context, which is an enormous kitchen sink, I grant you. But of course, I've been trying to produce a taxonomy of factors that would make a speech act more dangerous within the social and historical context. And the fifth and last criterion is the means of dissemination, which could be a radio station. If an entire community is getting most of its information from one particular radio station, then the fact that a message was transmitted over those airwaves would itself give the Speech Act greater force or greater influence over that audience. Another type of means of dissemination is the language in which the speaker is communicating. So, for example, in Kenya, every single Kenyan I've discussed this with, lots you can imagine, has said, if I hear a message in English or in Kiswahili, I hear it with my head. If I hear it in my mother tongue, that's a vernacular or a tribal language, then I hear it with my heart, and it's going to get me faster and more. So there are also other means of dissemination which can be influential, but I'm going to speed along. So now just very quickly, some questions indicating the factors within each of these criteria that allow for a more detailed analysis. These are just examples, they're not comprehensive, that would take too long. And now some examples of such speech. So this is Simon Makindi, a guy who's extremely famous and popular singer in Rwanda before the genocide. He was convicted of incitement to genocide afterward. Charles Begoudet from the Ivory Coast. Second criterion, the audience. These are just, again, some examples of factors that may make an audience more susceptible to dangerous speech. The meaning of the Speech Act, and now I'm just going to mention some of these hallmarks or telltale signs of dangerous speech, which, of course, are aspects of the meaning of the Speech Act. So, two of them. The first one is very familiar to you, I'm sure. Dangerous speech almost always, in one way or another, dehumanizes the target group, usually by referring to them as animals, as vermin, as pests. I'm sorry to tell you that I can say rats and cockroaches in more languages than I can count, because, or at least recognize the terms, because those are the most common terms used to dehumanize another group of people, perhaps because those seem to be the most universally despised creatures. So why does the inflammatory speaker, or the dangerous speech entrepreneur, as I sometimes call them, seek to dehumanize the audience? This performs collective psychosocial work, which is to make the other group seem less than human, right? Why? Because then it makes killing them or hurting them in other ways seem acceptable. It seems acceptable. But if you're a really good violent speech entrepreneur, dangerous speech entrepreneur, you'd like to go beyond training your audience to see atrocities as acceptable. You'd like to go beyond, and you'd like to make them seem what? Necessary, exactly. You want them to seem necessary. That's your real goal. So what do? You use this technique that was nicknamed accusation in a mirror by a Hutu propaganda strategist who wrote a manual that was discovered after the genocide. And unfortunately, this term is a beautiful, apt term. You tell your own audience that they are facing a mortal threat from the other group, which is planning to do to them what you are in fact hoping to carry out against the victim group. So you're Hitler in January of 1939, and what do you tell the German people? And then you repeat it over and over and over, because that's another thing that makes speech effective. Anybody remember? This was a classic element of Nazi propaganda. You tell the German people that they are facing a mortal threat from international Jewry, which is planning to annihilate the German folk. And as I said, then you repeat it. It's a little peculiar to, when you think about it, that Hitler and Goebbels and other Nazi leaders were able to persuade the German people that they were facing annihilation by the Jews, who incidentally didn't have any weapons. And yet, that was a successful, relentless element of Nazi propaganda. Hutu propaganda, same thing. The Tutsi are planning to wipe you out, man, woman, and child. And then the Sunnis are destroying your shrines is not quite the same, but I would be amazed if the Syrian whispering didn't include, they are coming to get us, they're going to wipe us out, they're going to kill us all, etc., etc. Just mentioned a third telltale sign, which has to do with purity. You say they are besmirching, they are despoiling, they are polluting our group. This is another hallmark or telltale sign. I use these terms because I'm talking about forms of rhetoric that recur over and over and over from case to case, from historical period to historical period all over the world. It's quite uncanny when you start looking at many cases. Okay, so these are just some other examples, and I use these slides in part to demonstrate that this is not a phenomenon particular to one part of the world or to one historical period. In fact, I've been saddened that often, since I've been working recently in sub-Saharan Africa, Africans will sometimes say to me, "Oh yeah, this is an African thing." So that's why I have lots of slides from lots of other parts of the world to disabuse them totally of that idea, which is totally false. By coincidence, this is another example from the Ivory Coast. You see that it refers to Serradegu, sewer rats. I mentioned before, cockroaches and rats recur with depressing regularity. So these are, again, just some factors of social and historical context. An example from India, Bal Thackeray finally died recently. And then means of dissemination. These are, again, just some questions to draw out details about the means of dissemination. And now a transition to Kenya. This is Joshua Aksang. He is one of the 4 defendants in the 2 International Criminal Court cases against Kenyans for responsibility for the so-called PEV, or post-election violence, of 2007 and 8 in Kenya. There is a very deep and widespread consensus in Kenya at all levels of society that hate speech, which is the term that people use there, was an important catalytic factor in the post-election violence in Kenya. That made it, that is one of the reasons why I chose to work in Kenya as a kind of test case over the last roughly 2.5 years. Another reason is that, of course, the obvious reason was that Kenya was facing the next presidential and national elections since 2007 and 8, this March. And yet another reason is that there are many interesting experiments that were already underway in Kenya, carried out by Kenyans and some by foreigners, but the most interesting ones, in my view, by Kenyans. So I was venturing into really a sort of national laboratory for experiments on dangerous speech in a society that was already quite concerned about it. Sometimes, in my view, too concerned about it. I say that, of course, tongue-in-cheek, but what I mean is that the consensus that hate speech was a big problem sometimes led to excessive regulation and over-definition of the term hate speech. So it was an ideal place to try to work out this problem of how to attempt to limit the dangerousness of speech without curbing freedom of expression. And as you might imagine, an electoral context is one in which you would need to be especially concerned about that double challenge, because if you repress speech during elections, then you can't expect a successful electoral process. So I took part in a number of different projects. One of them is called Umati, means crowd in Kiswahili. And this is, to our knowledge, the world's first systematic attempt to monitor the online space of a country, or I should say online spaces, lots of spaces, for hate speech and dangerous speech. And this is a little bit of a description of the Umati project before I show you a few more slides on that and talk a little bit about Umati. I'd like to tell you about another project because that is specifically intended to inoculate the Kenyan audience against dangerous speech. What we did in that project is to produce 4 episodes of a television program, not just any television program. It is a rampantly popular hit show in Kenya called Vyoja Mahakamani, which means events in the courtroom or what happened in the courtroom. And Americans say to me, oh, Judge Judy. And I think, no, not at all. It's a program that has been on the air, that has been on the KBC, Kenya Broadcasting Corporation airwaves since the 1970s, every Wednesday evening at 7:30. And I've never been able to find a Kenyan who hasn't heard of it or hasn't watched it and can't in fact name at least one of the characters. Usually several. So this show is a national phenomenon. It was started by an idealistic producer at KBC with the idea of illustrating what courtroom proceedings are like for the general public, so that if, God forbid, they would find themselves in court, they would understand a bit more about a judicial process. What does the judge do? Who's the prosecutor, et cetera, et cetera. And over the years, the show has evolved into a show that has quite a social conscience because it takes up many social issues. In each show, in each episode, there's a sort of a setup scene and somebody gets accused of a crime. And then in the rest of the show, that crime gets adjudicated. So in each of our 4 episodes, of course, somebody gets accused of a speech crime. The show is particularly interesting also because there's no screenwriter. It is every single episode is the collective creative project of all of the actors and the director together, sitting around, drinking tea in Kenyan fashion, and brainstorming together. So I had the tremendous privilege of taking part in that. And I also am now waiting on tenterhooks for the report of Lauren Kogan, an expert in evaluation of the impact of media programming from the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. She has done a study, and the report is due at the end of June. So if this worked at all, that would be quite exciting. And as I said, I'm not aware of many other efforts to do that kind of work, although it has been attempted much more in other fields. So now back to Umati. We wanted to find out, so first of all, there's been so much talk and writing about 207 and 8 and the inflammatory speech that was disseminated in political speeches, at rallies, in the media. Interestingly, Joshua Arap's son was not the only guy on the radio who who was making and disseminating inflammatory speech. He still has, in fact, a call-in talk show. So he both said inflammatory things and broadcast very inflammatory remarks by supposedly anonymous volunteer callers who were not so volunteer, but that's another story. So in 2007 and 2008, there was lots and lots of inflammatory speech, widely disseminated also via SMS, which is the case not only in Kenya, unfortunately, and also on the web. However, there is no decent collection of hate speech or dangerous speech from that 2007 and 2008 period. That's, I can tell you, been a bit frustrating for the prosecutors at the ICC. We wanted to make such a collection this time, in the months leading up to this next election that took place in March now, and wanted to try to do what I call smart monitoring, which is not just to collect, but to perform some analysis and categorization of what you're collecting as you collect it. So Ushahidi and iHub Research, two magnificent organizations in Kenya, you may have heard of Ushahidi, it's a pioneering crowdsourcing platform that was invented in response to the 2007 and 2008 violence. So this Umati is really the project of Ushahidi and iHub Research. I serve just as an advisor. They adapted my dangerous speech framework and came up with their own coding sheet, recruited monitors from several different ethnic groups in Kenya. Kenya has 43 different ethnic groups, of which between 5 and 7 are the largest and most prominent politically and largest producers of dangerous speech as well, for simple numerical reasons, among others. Those monitors, teams of monitors, had the exceedingly thankless task of sitting for hours in front of a series of computer screens, looking for hate speech and dangerous speech, collecting it and categorizing it. Here are the goals. So we wanted to test this methodology, see if we could make it work, develop a process for speech monitoring, particularly in the electoral context, that could work in other countries. And now, of course, one of the things I'm dying to do is to launch a similar project in another country. The online peacekeeping effort, as I mentioned to you, was a goal that we glued on in response to the levels and to the amount of dangerous speech that we found online, and also to the really hair-raising virulence of it. And then along those lines, we also mounted something of a civic education project about hate speech and dangerous speech, which is still going on. So what were the findings? As I've already told you, we were disappointed at how much hate speech and dangerous speech we found, in spite of the very extensive publicity and public education the government has ostensibly done against it since 2008. Umati categorized speech, or sorted speech, into 3 buckets, as they call them. 1, offensive speech. Number 2, moderately dangerous speech. That's the one in the middle. I don't know if you can see it from the back. And the 3rd, what they called extremely dangerous speech. And as you can see, it increased. For those of you who can't see, those are months: October, November, December, January, February, and March, the month of the election itself. I'm just going to show you a couple more slides on the most notable findings and the most surprising ones. First of all, the producers of hate speech and dangerous speech online didn't do very much to hide their identities. We were surprised by that. So you can see these tiny little almost ticks on the graph, and then those big long bars are identifiable commenters. all the way over on the right. Another interesting and quite provocative finding that suggests further inquiry is that of the more than 4,000 examples of dangerous speech that we found, more than 80% were on Facebook pages. But tiny numbers were tweets. We have saved what they call the hose. That's 2 weeks of literally millions of tweets regarding Kenya and the Kenyan elections for the 2 weeks before and after the elections, and are, of course, now eager to study them to try to figure this out. Anecdotal evidence, well, there are several reasons why I think this is the case. Maybe I'll leave that for Q&A. And so just a few more questions for further research. Did the framework provide consistent classification? You know, one major challenge for monitoring, and particularly for scaling up monitoring, is that the dangerousness of speech is extremely context dependent, as the guidelines suggest. It's very difficult to train, I think, to train software to recognize and identify context. So if you have to do the monitoring with humans, that means it's very labor and time intensive and expensive. But it also may not be consistent because individual people's perceptions vary. So we now having done this project for about 6 months, we need to test the results to see if they are consistent. And then the second question is really another way of comparing subjective estimations with the analytical framework to see if it's successfully providing some objective analysis. And then social effects of inflammatory speech online, that's reaching toward trying to understand better the link between inflammatory speech and violence. And of course, I'm asking that question explicitly at the bottom of this slide. So that's it for the moment, and I would welcome your questions.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Just 1 second, I need a minute. Yes, please.
My name is Anwar Khan. I am a Rohingya from Burma.
Might be going to Burma next week.
All of these things are very vivid in my memory. All of these things are there. Before the killing, mass killing started last year, they label us as viruses, and they label us as that we're eating the Buddhists up, and they need to get rid of us as soon as possible. And also, we're going to somehow make this Burma, entire Burmese society, to a Muslim society, and all sorts of things. And now, my question comes actually, what we can do? Everything is allowed by the government or aided by the government. These people, they use government resources, television, radios, newspapers. Nothing is blocked. And also, actually, most of the projects are run by the government itself. So when it is not an individual or a group, what can we do to prevent it? For example, these religious figures, they created a group called 969, some attributes of Buddhism. And those big figures, they become actually millionaire overnight when they release a tape or a lengthy speech hating Muslims. And one of those monks recently visited Canada. Unfortunately, Mr. Kenny, Jason Kenny, met him, and it was a big thing, meeting a Buddhist monk coming from Burma. Burma is opening up and stuff like that. So international community, although entire world is aware of it, not doing anything. So again, the question is what we can do to stop or to make the government responsible for this hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I have been studying Burmese speech from inside Burma and also from the diaspora now for more than a year with a terrible sense of dread. It does follow these patterns to a very frustrating and depressing extent. You know, it's so unpleasant to find that the ideas seem to make sense. You know, I wish that were the case. In response to your question, what can one do? Several things. First of all, as you know, the diaspora or diasporas, they are varied, have quite a great influence in Burma, and so it's important to work much more to educate influential speakers inside and outside the country to the capacity, the power that such speech has, and the individual responsibility of a speaker who makes it or disseminates it. For example, in the Kenyan case, in March of last year, Ekaterina Trendafilova, one of the judges at the International Criminal Court handling the Kenyan case, addressed the defendants who had appeared for a hearing and said, I know what you've been saying lately. You are at large while awaiting prosecution, but if you keep it up, you might not remain at large. That was depending on how you view it, a striking example of the International Court intervening in domestic politics, or quite an effective warning by an international figure that speech in certain contexts can be an international crime. So then the second suggestion I would make is to remind or to tell influential speakers that they have a responsibility to make counter-speech. Others who can influence the same communities have a very strong moral responsibility, if not also a legal responsibility, to counteract, as your colleague suggested, to counteract such messages. That might include simply reporting the falseness of malicious, false rumors, of dangerous speech that is rumor, as we encouraged Kenyans to do with the Nithi Ukweli project. It may also mean undermining the legitimacy of speakers like the monk in question, who's been proudly calling himself the Burmese Osama bin Laden for the vicious, outrageous tirades he's making against Muslims. So I'm sure you imagine who some of the people I'm thinking of when I say there hasn't been anywhere near enough denunciation of such speech by other speakers who are very influential in Burma. Is that helpful?
Yeah, unfortunately, we do not have great speakers in diaspora, that many. Just a few, Dr. Zani and Mutizo and a few others probably are aware of them. The issue is now the entire country believes, entire population, like Buddhist population, they believe that to be a Burmese is to be a Buddhist. That is the phrase. It has been being disseminated in the country since 1980s until now. And now even movie stars, female or male, they are using these derogatory words in their acts or in the movies. Actually, it's been so popular that hating Muslims or hating non-Buddhists, I would say, is a big business and is the trend. And since we do not really have the so-called influential speakers outside of Burma, I think everything kind of lies on the shoulders of this international community.
I'm not sure of that because, so trends can go both ways. In Baghdad, there was a time when it was perfectly acceptable for Muslims and Christians to marry. Now people feel they have to choose between being Sunni and Shia and so forth. Those trends can also go the other way and do. There are examples of courageous, influential speakers who have pushed back on this kind of trend. It isn't inevitable. What we need to recognize is the enormous influence and power of such speech, and then disseminate the idea that with influence over an audience comes responsibility.
Thank you, Susan, for your presentation. I'd like to go back to the historical context that you mentioned a bit. I mean, my own research and interests have been, in part, looking at Germany, the experience of Germany, and then comparing it with Serbia. Particularly when I think about the relevance of what we call founding myths. So if you think of Milosevic, the famous speech he made at the Battle of the Kosovo Poli, go back to Hitler, and I mean the reference to the diktat and the staff in the back. I wonder, in terms of more comparative, I am sensitive to the fact that you want comparative to go across cases. If you think that, that there's a causal link, but again, there's a catalyzing link between speech reference to founding myths and the ability of that, shall we say, myth, the relevance of it, the enduring relevance of it, to catalyze in a more powerful way. Because there you're reaching the heart, not just the mind. I mean, it's a fear factor. I mean, in both, I think the German case you brought up, certainly with the Serbs, there was the feeling not only of fear but of victimization. I mean, that becomes very, very powerful in and of itself when it's constantly referred to that in speech and discourse. And I was just wondering if across cases you found that references to founding myths make a difference.
Absolutely. I have thought of conceptualizing that as a subset of accusation in a mirror. So you could have accusation in a mirror forward or accusation in a mirror backward. They did this to us. Therefore, we are aggrieved, we are victims, and any action we take against them is justified by the atrocities that they committed, real or false. Let's be frank, you can find cases of both, of speech that references false atrocities in the past and also actual atrocities in the past. So a narrative, a founding myth like that, builds a sense of victimization and of fear, which are, if I had to name only one factor that disposes a population to condone violence, it would be fear/victimization. If you can create fear, of course, that's really what you're after. You can maybe boil all of, the first half of my talk down to create fear, create an abiding conviction about fear. I hope that...
It does, I think it has a relevance in what you're saying, because when you work backward, then the ways that you might try to interrupt, I think, are a bit different. Because then you're talking about constructing narratives that dispel what people believe happened in the past. And that's a whole, I think, subset of what we're talking about.
It's always about constructing narrative, though. And it is extraordinary what a tremendous influence you can have over people by constructing or reconstructing a narrative. That's how all of us make sense of the world. And I'd just like to reinforce my previous point by giving the example of Kenya in 2013, the current election, which took place largely, although not entirely, without violence. After a remarkable collective outpouring of what Kenyans got used to calling peace propaganda. So some of it was, paid for by some of the institutions that you work for, and was really foreign inspired and was sometimes perceived by Kenyans as foreign and so forth. But a lot of it was Kenyan, or I should say, and a lot of it was Kenyan. The fact that peace propaganda was foreign didn't automatically discredit it. I don't want to give that idea. But it was even more striking when, for example, the biggest paint company in Kenya started a big ad campaign about national unity and, we're different colors and different tribes, but we're all Kenyan. There were enormous billboards in Nairobi showing religious leaders of different faiths standing together calling for peace and unity. One of the most hallucinatory examples was when the GSU, the General Service Unit, which is a fearsome army unit that during the dictatorship of Daniel Arap Moi was famous for busting the heads of students who were demonstrating for democracy in elections. So it was particularly ironic when the GSU donned their battle camouflage gear and recorded a music video. I'm not making this up. A music video with a well-known, pop star. They were swaying back and forth and singing and dancing, calling for peace and unity and so forth. We don't know exactly what impact all of this counter-speech had, but again, I'm not going to claim any causation since we don't have data, but it seems impossible that it didn't have some impact. And most notably, I told you that I have a few hypotheses why there was so little dangerous speech on Twitter. One of them is spontaneous community policing. So one Kenyan would send out a message of frustration or even just impatience or incitement on Twitter, and someone else would respond. And this is particularly in the 5 days after the election when all of Kenya was waiting with great anxiety and tension for the result to be announced. So someone else would respond and say, oh, remember, we're all Kenyans. We really are in this together. We have to stick together. That's a narrative that was largely absent in 2007 and 8. By the way, also Kenyan journalists, even TV presenters who were on TV nonstop for 5 days, waiting for the electoral results, kept on saying, departing arguably from their normal journalistic role, kept on saying, we're all Kenyans, we've got to be patient, and by the way, let us show you these tweets about patience and unity and so forth. So I'm just trying to make the case that you can construct narratives of all kinds, and if you repeat them enough, they seem to have an impact.
Once again, thank you for the excellent presentation. Given that my own contextual knowledge and interest is in the spaces of conversation and dialogue in Rwanda, along with many of us here, I wanted to get your thoughts. Given the great transition also of peace propaganda, I wanted to get some of your thoughts about the passage of some of the genocide ideology laws in Rwanda and what that means potentially going forward when the 2017 election comes up. Obviously comparing the diaspora of Rwanda to the in-state voices that are being heard, there's a big discrepancy in what is being said. So
yes.
I just want to get some of your thoughts about that.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, as you heard, I very strongly believe in freedom of expression. And Rwanda is the first example I usually give of misguided, excessive regulation of speech. The laws against ethnic divisionism and genocidal ideology, as you know, have been defined extremely broadly and applied very broadly to silence opposition to the government and to foreclose expressions of grievance or dissent. The mere stating of a peace message is not enough to construct a narrative that people will internalize. I I was struck also by the example of Lebanon. It's not enough to require that in every falafel place or every institution, you know, each ethnic group is represented. It has to feel genuine to people. In fact, before we produced those Vioja Mahakamani television episodes I told you about, I convened some Kenyan journalists and filmmakers and other people who had some related experience and asked for advice. And the single predominant piece of advice was, it has to feel real to people and it mustn't feel like a lecture. You know, you can't just legislate something like that. You can't make people feel Rwandan rather than Hutu or Tutsi by forcing it on them by means of criminal law. It seems to me that, unfortunately, there are many examples, historical examples that demonstrate that. You know, I can't finish that answer without saying that I was in Rwanda last summer for the end of the Gacaca process and the attended ceremonies, and spoke with some officials from the Ministry of Justice who know what I do, and so immediately said, "So, what do you think of our, what do you think of our laws on speech? Aren't they great?" You know, and I had to say, no, I think they're terrible, actually. And then they said, the danger is so enormous here. We don't have the luxury of lifting the lid, you know. And when we inherited this country, you know, it wasn't just an indescribable devastation with literally piles of thousands of bodies, and look what we've done, and look how great it is, and so forth. And so I must say with humility that it was very difficult to respond to that. But I do remain deeply convinced that repression of speech is not going to work in the long run. And the other, I also have to add that in the digital age, it just doesn't work very well. That's how you get this big discrepancy between what diasporic Rwandans are saying and Rwandans are, after all, reading, and what is being said publicly in Rwanda. Yes?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I think it's one of the best one I've seen here during the 3 days.
Wow, given what I know of the other presentations, I'm enormously flattered by
Because
that.
I
Thank
think
you.
you already have some sort of tool and a real deep research already done, and to try to bring through this, because you mentioned further research, I think to identify hate speech or some sort of thing, we tend to, we should maybe check in our humanity, in your, it could reside in the past, okay? Let's look at our past and our error. And if we try to go before we were all Kenyan or all Canadian or all American, we were all human. And religion, all those kind of things, if you want to go back, you have to go back for 2,000 years before, even more, and try to go where some sort of animus was, where, you know. I think the answer to classify the five criteria could reside in philosophy like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and one of the best ways to do it, I think, is to try to identify all sophisms that are in those kind of speech. So the sophism with Aristotle, for example, one of the most popular, because there's a lot of categories in there. And I think the one that is most popular right now is the one about George Bush that says, if you're not with us, you're against us, which is one of the false dilemma of one of those type of sophisms. So if you get all of those, you might be able to try to at least identify deeper and maybe count numbers of sophisms. Is it because white people doesn't believe in democracy right now, or they don't know vote? It's because politicians are expert in sophism. I think it's everywhere. If you learn the the other type, or you just get aware about which type exists, I think we can make something true.
It's very true that if you're not with us, you're against us is a common hallmark of dangerous speech. It's also, as you point out implicitly, a very common hallmark of ordinary political speech. So just to give an example, I know this was part of the Gallup, and we went very quickly through the slides, but the example of Simon McKinney, of the pop star from Rwanda that I showed, was of a song in which he sings that he despises those de-Hutuized Hutus. In other words, Hutus who didn't hate Tutsis well enough, or enough. So the demonization of members of the majority group or the audience group for not being adequately, not hating the target group sufficiently is also a classic hallmark. I must say, though, in response to this very useful question, that I also found myself reminding Kenyans often that dangerous speech and legitimate political speech share characteristics. So, for example, you can't really campaign politically without exalting yourself and your own group in some way and putting down your opponent and his or her group. So there are certain rhetorical moves that that don't automatically make speech dangerous, although in certain contexts they may contribute to that. So that's why I think it's also very important to come up with a fairly thoughtful and nuanced classification system. And that in turn begs the question that people often ask me, so how do we automate this? In any case, as you suggest, there's lots and lots of research yet to be done. This is only a very sort of tentative beginning.
Well, we've not met until this morning, and it's a huge privilege. I think that you have brought to the study of incitement and hate speech a kind of conceptual and theoretical richness and the kind of methodological rigor which is badly needed. And that's a very special and great contribution. So thank you for all of that.
The privilege is mine. You must know that. I've been telling you that for years. I've been reading him since I was reading him.
I know that you know this, but I want to share it and use it for a question. I'm headed towards Rwanda. When I start with Nuremberg, and Telford Taylor's argument in his memoir that Julius Streicher really never killed anybody. He should probably not have been tried in Nuremberg. He certainly should never have been hung for his crimes because he didn't actually physically assault anyone and didn't give an order to assault anyone. And as you know, I've written Telford Taylor, a couple hundred pages later in the same memoir, talks about the young Wehrmacht soldiers who participated in mass atrocities on the Eastern Front and says, but we have to remember they've been reading U.S. Streicher and Nazi propaganda ever since they entered school, and therefore they were conditioned to do these things, but he never connects the two dots and sticks with his First Amendment position, which is very
But you did.
Yeah. So Scott Strauss, as you probably know, in his book Order of Genocide, and in his articles and other research, has concluded, based on interviews with a number of lower-level killers who he interviewed in prison, who told him, no, RTLM, the hate radio station, didn't really influence them very much. They killed because they felt threatened. They killed because their neighbors were in peril. They had to defend against the threat of Tutsi genocide against Hutu. And like Telford Taylor, in some ways, I think Scott submerges the background, not only of RTLM, but years of Rwandan government propaganda and disinformation about about the RPF threat as a genocidal threat. And I'm wondering if we don't need to revisit Rwanda and using some of the methods you developed more systematically, go back and try and pull the prize out from under the ground, so to speak. Because the question has only been researched impressionistically. And
Yes.
as you pointed out, the international tribunal judgments are not social science. They're court judgments. That's a different story. I think it would be very useful. And since so many of our concepts really have their roots either in the Nazi experience or in the Rwandan experience, I think it's vital that we bring the Rwandan experience up to a higher level. And that would help us also perhaps with the Rwandan government if that's possible. I think that when we look at Burma, and I think until you've been there on this next trip, and I hope that next trip will happen, it will be a trip to Burma, and then you really know something because you will have been on the ground, etc. It's really important also to consider what we heard from Anwar. And Anwar, I've been asking you since you came, what is the one thing we can do? And you never mentioned all this stuff about hate speech. So as in the past, the second day I remonstrated with Anwar because he keeps coming up with these gems, but they are really, and I have the same problem, Anwar, you do. They're precipitated by what people are saying, right? It's all a question of the context. So you remember in Rwanda, there was that little group of Swiss and others who tried to set up a transmitter when the genocide first started to broadcast into Rwanda and to counter the disinformation of RTLM. And it got so dangerous for them, they bailed out after a few days. But in the case of Burma or Myanmar, it might be possible to attempt something like that. I think, Anwar, your message was the government is not going to help us. The government's part of the problem. They may indeed be behind a lot of this rhetoric that's so dangerous. So,
Can I just interject? Because I can't help it.
Yeah.
There are some people around who have some influence on the Burmese government.
Yes. One of them met in Washington recently. Somebody else who has some influence from Burma, you're quite right. But I think, you may already know this, but when I spoke a few weeks ago with some of the people who are in and out of Burma all the time, there is a real fear that what underlies what's happening to the Rohingya is only the tip of the iceberg,
Yes.
as you probably know. And there's something else much bigger
Mm-hmm.
behind it and coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so that influence may influence one faction, but not the other faction. So we all don't like the term red line. We agreed on that this morning. But I think a red line of some sort does need to be drawn. And we should attempt everything possible with people inside, because they're the most important. But I wonder if maybe we could think back to, you haven't mentioned Search for Common Ground, although I know you know your programs in
Yes.
Kenya and elsewhere very well. The approach of going in and helping, empowering people to do their own dramas and deal with their own issues, which they are pioneers in, is a very useful approach. But sometimes also, the old Voice of America approach or the old BBC approach of broadcasting in from outside can be very helpful. Now, you were not here, but Anwar told us, for example, that in Rohingya areas, the government bans cell phones. And they don't want anyone gathering evidence, even with videos or pictures from cell phones, etc. But there are, I assume, radios, Anwar, right? There are radios, portable radios with batteries and other ones. So the question really is, and here I don't want to take more time, but if you could just think out loud with us for a minute about what might be an effective basic strategy to pair whatever can happen and emerge from inside with messages from outside. Maybe messages from outside are always illegitimate. Maybe, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. So what sort of inoculation might still be possible in Myanmar? if it originated from outside. Thank you.
So you've raised so many good points. Maybe I'll start at the end and work backward. First of all, I think it's important to distinguish between two kinds of what we could generally call counter speech or ways of working against dangerous speech. One is inoculation, and I use that term advisedly because just like inoculation in the public health context, it won't work at the last minute. You're talking about education, about trying to change the narrative, change the discourse, and that takes some time. So it's important to recognize, it seems to me, that certain tools are useful at certain points, and then other tools are useful at other points. So maybe overdoing the public health metaphors, I've also talked about injecting positive speech or counter speech at a point when the narrative has already gone some distance in the wrong direction. In Syria or in Burma at the moment, it's probably too late for inoculation. So that's why I'm putting the emphasis on the personal responsibility of individual speakers to stand up and say in a way that gets noticed, as they certainly know how to do, this is unacceptable and may even be criminal. It has to become a question of individual personal responsibility on the part of people who, in my view, have a heightened responsibility because of their heightened degree of influence. In other words, the Burmese public and also Burmese leaders, including regional police and military officials, must learn quickly that they may bear personal responsibility for violence that takes place in a context of uncountered, unchecked incitement. That is a clear task. That said, I don't think it's true that that messages that come from outside are automatically ignored. It depends very much on how those messages are broadcast, literally and figuratively. And I think it's worth taking a look at the guidelines again for that. Who's the speaker? You know, when we were recording the Vyoja Mahakamani shows, the magnificent actors, who, by the way, are themselves a sort of United Nations of Kenya. They come from various tribes, and they've been working together for many, many years. So while we rode around Kenya in a van for 2.5 days recording the shows, you can imagine there were lots of interesting conversations. And they invited me to be in one of the episodes. I wouldn't have done it. Because one of the first lessons that came from the people giving advice in advance was, you'll forgive me, they said, it can't feel mzungu. It can't feel foreign, and it mustn't feel didactic. It mustn't feel like a lecture. So it's my guess and my hope that Vyoja Mahakamani was a wonderful sort of delivery mechanism because it's a drama, but it's also very funny, and it's exceedingly Kenyan. Now, you can find a Vyoja Mahakamani in every country, but in order to do inoculation or injection, you have to, at a minimum, work with people who know the country and the culture and the social environment exceedingly well. In the same way you can't have foreigners monitoring speech meaningfully. So those are my suggestions on that. With respect to Scott Strauss's book and an analysis of Rwanda, I couldn't agree more that we should study it more. There is contradictory evidence based on interviews with génocidaires after the fact. Some sets of interviews report the génocidaires saying that they were not influenced by RTLM. Others said they were influenced. Almost all of these interviews took place many, many years, as much as a decade after the genocide, and so Scott is a tremendously admired colleague. So I'm not talking about his interviews in particular, but, and we all are, of course, as scholars and activists and researchers, doing the best we can in the circumstances. But it seems to me such interviews are so subject to distortions. For example, if I'm, you know, serving time in prison for massacring people, and someone asks me, why did you do it? Was it because you were tremendously influenced by these awful people who were broadcasting these awful messages? What would you say? You know, which raises the question, you know, why would they say they weren't influenced? And then on that side, I would say, what does it mean for somebody not to be influenced? Does it mean that he wasn't listening to the radio station himself, you know, for hours on end? Or is it possible that RTLM, which was, by the way, Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, the famous radio station that was nicknamed Radio Machete, for the awful messages that it disseminated, you know, my guess is that it was part of a relentless blizzard of messages that presented a certain narrative that itself was essential in bringing about the genocide. Not necessarily, by the way, because génocidaires, the guys who carried it out, believed it, but because their aunties and their grandmas absorbed this message. So in order to understand the impact of speech, I think you can't just ask how it affects the actions of the, frankly, small proportion of people within a given society who actually carry out genocide and other atrocities. You also have to ask, how did the speech or any other factor shift the whole society? There are discourse norms, forgive me for geeky language, but any society has discourse norms at a given point. So there are certain things that a 15-year-old, you know, teenage kid will say, certain kinds of language that he will use commonly with his buddies. And then there's certain kinds of discourse that he'll use with his grandma and everything in between. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum, forgive me for sort of picking on grandmas as, you know, the other extreme, but there's certain things that grandma will say in a particular society. And now there is a gradual campaign of inflammatory speech, which shifts, it's my guess, the whole normative structure, so that the aunties and grandmas will say and implicitly condone things that they would never have condoned before, and that allows a 15-year-old to be paid 50 shillings to go murder somebody in the tacit sort of unconscious awareness that his own community, his granny and his auntie, will not ostracize him for doing that. So it seems to me needs to be a deeper set of questions. I also would just like to mention there's very little quantitative evidence of the link between speech and mass violence, but there is now a bit. And there's one paper that any of you interested in this might like to look up. It is by David Yanagisawa Drott. Yanagisawa was not a difficult enough name. So. David Yanagisawa Drott, it's called Propaganda and Discourse, I think, in the Rwandan Genocide. He used econometrics, fancy statistics, to look for a correlation between having received the signal of RTLM, the radio station, with levels of violence during the genocide, and took advantage of the exceptional topography of Rwanda. It's nicknamed the land of Mille Collines, that's where the radio station got its name. It means 1,000 hills. So Yanagisawa Drott found a large data set of matched pairs of villages in which one village was at the top of the hill and the other one at the bottom, but they were demographically and in other ways similar, and so he compared levels of violence, or rather he used the proxy of gacaca prosecutions among villages that received the signal of this radio station with villages that did not, and his paper indicates some considerable effect, but all of these are, like my own work, I think still very preliminary, and so I do agree it must be studied more. it's a very interesting paper, and as I say, it's exceptional. There's also a wonderful paper, a qualitative analysis of the impact of false rumors, which are an especially potent form of dangerous speech, as Besma and I have both told you. Well, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. You gave us a good example of that. Lots of examples from other places. So there is a beautiful paper by Michelle Osborne at Oxford describing directly the impact of false rumors in Kenya in 2007 and 8 in informal settlements in Nairobi. And then finally on Julius Streicher, which I can't not mention briefly. Okay, running out of time. Streicher, as you may know, was the editor of a Nazi publication called Der Stürmer, the Stormtrooper. And as Frank said, he was tried and executed at Nuremberg for what he published in that newspaper. The very short judgment, it's only a page and a half. Modern judges maybe take an example from the length of the judgment, but it is somewhat inscrutable because Streicher was convicted of crimes against humanity since incitement to genocide had not yet been codified as a crime. But the judgment never actually says why he was convicted, and there are conflicting interpretations, as you might imagine. My own is that he was convicted for the fact that he continued to publish the sorts of vicious, virulent dehumanization of Jews and I mean, can't even use the term anti-Semitism. It was violent, dangerous speech. He continued to publish it even after he knew that what he was encouraging was actually being carried out. In other words, the Jews were being massacred in the East. Ironically, you found out by reading Jewish newspapers. So, my own impression is that he was convicted in some sense for the knowledge element, for having continued to call for such things when he couldn't possibly have said that it was only figurative or symbolic, or he didn't really mean it, and so forth. So there's more that could be said about that, but I'll just say one last thing, which is that I first got into this work for a number of reasons. One was the Rwanda genocide and the radio station and so on. The other one is that I served briefly as a law clerk at the ICTY at the Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia. And we were working on I was on the Carnage trial team. Again, it was just a baby, a little intern, but we were trying to figure out a prosecution strategy. And the tribunal was trying to apply theories of command responsibility to what we were calling civilian superior liability, which in my view is a poor graft. Command responsibility works in the military context because you've got a chain of command. What the prosecutors were trying to argue is that Karadzic was responsible for Srebrenica because maybe he gave, an order, or he said something that, could have been interpreted as an order maybe by somebody else, Mladic, etc. No, by the time Srebrenica happened, the conditions had been created, in my view, by the speeches of Milosevic and Karadzic and people like them, Vojislav Šešelj, another guy, so that Mladic didn't need to have an order from a civilian political leader. So at the heart of my work is also the quest for what it is that civilian political leaders do that unleashes all of this. And it seems to me we need to figure that out because they do something that makes it possible for things to become abnormal. I so appreciated the term, this is normal, this is not normal. Does that, I hope that makes sense. And so that's also why I'm obsessed with inflammatory speech.
Thank you. My name is Laszlo Serkany. I'm from Humboldt University of West Ontario. And a very quick question here, and Professor Chalk actually put quite eloquently. When does counter speech become real?
Become real, did you say?
Real, yes. And by real, what I mean is that when it comes to hate speech, it seems to me that we are appealing to emotions. Sorry.
Just hear the sirens. Go ahead.
There's a strong appeal to emotion. So when does the mind become engaged in a moral compass?
What a wonderful question. I would say, like all of them, by the way, I would say that counter-speech becomes real when it takes hold in a population, so that the discourse begins to shift away from the poisonous kind of discourse that I've been describing. And so the catch, the trick, the goal for me is, how do you cause that to happen? How do you make it real?
Hi, Andrew Kendall. Very quickly, if you aren't aware of the Sri Lankan situation already in terms of the hate speech context, I'm presuming you probably are.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, one can argue that there's been hate speech going on there since 1956, if not earlier, and mass atrocities on and off since 1971, not
Yes.
just between Sinhalese and Tamils, also Sinhalese on Sinhalese. Currently, around the same time as the situation in Burma started to erupt vis-a-vis Muslims in Burma, the state authorities backed a Buddhist group in Sri Lanka to start taking it out on the Sri Lankan Muslims. And just wanted to flag that with you. The Tamils are still being treated like the other as well in the country. There's supposed to be an election in Jaffna, at least at the moment. It's still scheduled in September. National elections are supposed to happen in 2015 and 2016. Possibly both will happen the same year. I've worked with the Center for Policy Alternatives, who has a very excellent election monitoring group called the Center for Monitoring Election Violence on 5 different occasions from 2000 to 2010. I think they would very much benefit from your analytical framework and the use of the Ushahidi project. And
That's wonderful.
If you're not aware of Precursor Services organization, they're on the web, highly commendable. They get stick from the Sri Lankan government on a regular basis. Anyone you talk to about them will vouch for their bona fides, and they would, I think, immensely benefit from it.
There are two things that well, there are lots of things I would like, but among them, I'd like to persuade an election monitoring group to incorporate some of these ideas into their work. And number two, as I mentioned before, I'm very anxious to mount or see mounted projects like Umati in other countries so that we'll get some comparative data. Among other things, it would open up the possibility of looking for what computer scientists call attributes of dangerous speech that human monitors can't find. So
Yeah, of course.
there are very interesting possibilities there, you know.
The reason I think that your framework and the Ushahidi project in particular would be useful is because I don't think people fully realize that mass atrocity crimes in Sri Lanka are still very much a possibility, and very high possibility. And people shouldn't move their eye away from Sri Lanka. It
Right.
still needs to be watched very closely.
Right. Thank you so much. Yes, in fact, if you could put me in touch, that'd be great.
It seems that we're coming to a conclusion much too soon, doesn't it? Without biasing what you may still plan to write on your evaluation forms, I've had suggestions from several of you that when we do this kind of conference or training session next year, that we perhaps consider making it a little bit longer. and having breakout groups so that there's a possibility of maybe more interaction. And in order to assist the process of crystallizing a network coming out of this conference, I'd like to ask everybody to do something that I think we'll be doing in the future before other training conferences like this. And that is, would you please, in the next day or two, send us a 250-word short bio so that we can circulate to all of you as part of one email, as a PDF perhaps, and with your permission, include your email address. And then we will continue as a kind of listserv the address contacts, the contacts at those addresses. And every once in a while, from our end, we'll circulate stuff that we think you might find interesting. But I'm sure among yourselves, you will also have lots of ideas following up on these wonderfully stimulating presentations that we've had. I think that when Kyle first and Marie brought the idea of a professional training program to me to discuss the first time, it was their idea. We all understood that there were other training programs and that we would be building on the strengths of those programs. But I don't think we really understood how much would be coming from the people who registered. You know, there's always the danger of thinking hierarchically as if people who come to a program, it's a training program, so like we're training you. Well, you have been also training us, and we'd like that process to continue. And you've given us so much more than we might have anticipated, even in the context of the remarks in the introduction to the program. So first of all, I want to thank our wonderful presenters who made us look really good by presenting in a way that justified our judgment before the conference that we had invited the best of the best to be presenters at this workshop. And second, I want to take my hat off to all of you for the way in which you have interacted with the speakers and with each other to advance the discussion and to lay the foundation for what I hope will be a dialogue within a growing network. I was so happy a moment ago when Susan referred to the public health network as a great source of inspiration and ideas for what we do. Some of you will remember that I had mentioned earlier the importance of the public health people in the area of epidemiology and also countering bacteriological and other warfare, and the way in which we can learn from them and also look to them as allies together with the environmental movement and what we are doing. Our biggest job is to build out while we raise the level of not only knowledge but wisdom in this area. I think you can see from the presentations we've had this morning, among others, that the first task is knowledge and systematic learning that goes into knowledge creation. And then we have to develop the sagacité that will make this knowledge wisdom. And you are our local inspirations and sources of information. So from the perspective of where you sit in your NGO, in your international or national organization, in your security-focused vocation, please continue to the extent that you're permitted to do so, to share what you're learning. I'm going to turn the mic now over to Kyle, who wants to add a few words of his own. And let me just say, I think it'd be great to thank Kyle and Marie, who's over there, for the great job that they've done.
It's kind of unfortunate 2.5 days have gone so quickly. But I do get a sense that many of you have embraced what I said the first day, that we put this together not just to educate you, but to actually create a network, to create a hub, so that our institute will actually outreach with many different organizations, many experts that will then move to other organizations throughout their career. And we want to continue to actually be that enabler of collaboration, knowledge, and leadership. And so one thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually set up a LinkedIn account and invite everybody who's here, participants, our interns, our guest speakers, to become a member of that group, so we can share information, we can share the PowerPoint presentations that were done over the course of the last few days, and that you can stay, if you choose so, stay in touch with people on that digital platform. I want to thank our speakers, as Frank did, for coming. It means a lot. You're all experts. You've got busy schedules, a lot of speaking engagements, but that you can take the time to come here to Montreal to be part of our first initiative, which I said will be an annual event, so thank you so much. I want to thank our participants for coming here. Like I think Frank said as well, we learned as much from you as you learned from our speakers, and we want to thank you and build that relationship. Third, I really want to thank the MIGS team, Marie and the interns that have worked long hours in the past few months to put all this together. It looks like it's simple to put together, but anyone who's done a training program knows that many things can fall apart last minute. We're lucky that not one speaker canceled because of rains in northern New York or wherever. And I just want to end this perhaps by telling our participants that your certificates of completion of training are in the back, so you can gather that there. And we ask you to stay in touch and follow up with us and give us ideas on how we can improve this for the next generation and the next class we expect to receive next year. Thank you very much.